maybe we could be a little bit more strategic about only going after things that are actually significant to national security or to military use, as opposed to Christmas tree ornaments, which we are also tariffing for some unknown reason.
National emergency, I'm sure.
National emergency, exactly.
Welcome to the Mona Charen Show. So glad you could join me today. I am delighted to welcome the Bulwark's newest pundit. That is Catherine Rampell, formerly of the Washington Post, who covers economics and other matters, but she is mostly a specialist on the economic front, which is much needed all the time, but especially right now with the nuttiness that we are living through. So, Catherine, welcome. Thanks so much for joining me.
Great to join you. Thanks for having me.
We are now completing Trump's first year of his second term. And I thought now would be a good time to revisit some of the MAGA claims that were made. They've been made for many years now, but in particular in 2024, about what he was going to be able to do once in office. I'd like to start with a bugaboo of mine, and that is this constant story that he has been telling, and now the whole Republican Party has joined in, and honestly, some parts of the Democratic Party too, namely that we have had this terrible decline in manufacturing jobs in America because we made bad trade deals and we gave away our manufacturing sector to other countries. So let's start there. Is that true?
It is true that manufacturing jobs have been in structural decline for a very long time, for decades at this point. And it is true that there are certain parts of the country that have been particularly hurt by the loss of manufacturing jobs, partly because of trade, but also largely because of technological gains, right? A lot of jobs have been replaced by robots. Just as an example, we produce about as much steel as we did 30 years ago, but with half as many workers. It's almost all done by robots at this point.
Right.
And so it is true that, yes, China has overly invested in steel and has pushed down global prices and things like that. But here in the United States, we're still producing quite a lot of steel. It's just you don't need as many bodies to do that. And look, I get that every red-blooded American wants to root for the manufacturing industry to have a comeback. But it's just not going to happen. It's at least we should not be looking for manufacturing to be the sector that employs the majority of new jobs in the future, because we've had technological gains. It's very similar in some ways to farming. If you look at what share of Americans were in farming, based on the records available, it peaked in about the 1940s. And it's now all the way down to about 1% of the country today in terms of who works in what field literally, I guess, in this point. But I don't see that as a tragedy. I think that's a triumph of human ingenuity. It takes a lot fewer people, a lot less man hours to be able to feed people in this country and around the world. And we should celebrate that. Exactly.
And we're growing more things than we've ever grown, right? Despite the fact that we only do it with 1% of the population.
Right. It's very mechanized. And generally, I think that is a success story, in part because it's not like those jobs went away and then were not filled by other opportunities. They have been over the years. We can talk about the fact that there are different winners and losers, obviously, from technological change, whether in farming or in the buggy whip industry or in manufacturing. That's definitely true. But overall, as certain jobs have been displaced by robots, among other things, lots of other jobs have been created, and we have more jobs on record than has ever been the case. But that's largely because we've shifted into services over time.
Okay, so implicit in your answer is that this is a secular trend, that manufacturing has been declining as a share of employment, though not output, for decades.
Well, I mean, as a share of output, it's down too. But I'm just saying in like aggregate, the amount of stuff we still produce a lot of stuff. We just produce a lot more services.
Yes. Okay. This has been the result, if I am interpreting you correctly, of technological change, of efficiencies, and of progress, basically economic progress, and not because we made bad trade deals.
I generally see it that way. Look, I think that you can relitigate China's ascension to the WTO and think about how we might have done that differently. But I think the main takeaway from our trade policies of the last couple of decades is not that we had too much trade. It's that we didn't adequately prepare people for the transition, the inevitable transition that would come, that we were going to lose jobs, particularly in lower value manufacturing sectors. But that happened. That is unequivocal. A lot of those jobs moved to China, but they also moved to other parts of the world, Vietnam, Malaysia, Mexico, et cetera. That was going to happen no matter what. The mishandling, if you will, of trade policy had to do with compensating the so-called losers in helping them transition and find other kinds of job opportunities. It's not that we should not have opened up ourselves to more global trade, because overall, opening up the U.S. to greater trade has improved living standards here. Again, there have been people who lost jobs, but overall, we have helped people be richer, essentially, in the United States. And the solution for people who lost their jobs is to help them get better, different jobs, because you can't turn back the clock.
Right. Okay. So another aspect of this that you hear a lot from the MAGA people, or that they imagine, I think, that, we're going to be in, Trump keeps talking about, we're going to have all these dollars flowing into the United States. People are going to want to be opening factories here. And there's going to be this boom in manufacturing, and thereby the implicit message is that people with a high school diploma are going to be able to take these jobs. But let's talk about what manufacturing jobs are really like now, because they're much more high skill, aren't they, than they used to be. It's the world where you could get a high school diploma and walk into a good factory job is kind of it's not entirely a thing of the past, but it's certainly they're not as plentiful as they once were, right?
That's absolutely true. And that's been true for a long time. That, again, the share of jobs in this country, the number of jobs in this country, the share of jobs in this country in manufacturing has been declining. But the new jobs that have been created are overwhelmingly requiring much higher skills. So as you put it, back in the day, you could graduate high school, walk down the street to the factory floor and get a job, and you would be sufficiently qualified. But because there have been these technological advancements, because there's much more automation involved, the kinds of skills you need are different. And actually, I pulled up before this podcast, some data on this. This data is a little bit old, but it's from a Congressional Research Service report from a few years ago that found that the profile of a manufacturing worker has very much changed. And I wonder if part of the reason why Americans feel so much nostalgia for these manufacturing jobs from this golden era of manufacturing is that not so much that the jobs themselves were so great. They were hard jobs, right? People got injured.
They did. They also had burnout and boredom, and
yes,
being on an assembly line is not the most stimulating work in the world.
Right. I think what was attractive, particularly in the collective memory about these jobs, is the fact that they were like solid middle class jobs that did not require a lot of additional schooling. And that's just not the kinds of jobs you're going to get today. If you were to massively increase employment in this sector, they're not going to look like the jobs of yesteryear, for better or for ill. They're going to be very different jobs. So the idea that you're going to re-employ all of the people who lost their jobs at the local factory that closed down in Ohio 20 years ago, first of all, those people are probably, no longer of working age. But second of all, their skill set, their training is not going to get them prepared, ready to take the so-called jobs of the future, the more advanced manufacturing jobs. So it's a totally different world. I think people want to hark back to this era when there were these jobs that were plentiful, that paid solid middle-class wages, but they don't exist. And we should kind of stop trying to will them into being. And instead, my view is if the thing that you miss about manufacturing jobs of old is that they paid reasonably well, they were more stable or what have you, look at the jobs that we are creating and try to improve those. There are a lot more people who are working as janitors and wait staff, food services staff. There are a lot of services jobs that have been created over the years, retail jobs that are that don't require additional skill or additional education, I should say, additional credentials that we could improve, that we could find ways to make better through the social safety net or other interventions, cracking down on wage theft, things like that. And we should focus our efforts there rather than trying to turn back the clock to an industry that doesn't exist.
What's wage theft?
Wage theft is when employers are supposed to pay people, but they don't pay them their full wages. So let's say they're not paying them the full minimum wage, they're not paying them overtime, or they're not paying them at all. It's an issue in some it's a bigger issue in industries like fast food. There have been a bunch of problems with McDonald's franchisees over the years, with agriculture, particularly if there are a lot of employees who are immigrants. So
yeah, I was about to say, I bet it's because they want to take advantage of immigrants.
Yes. So I guess my basic takeaway is rather than trying to recreate jobs of the past, which in many ways were not so great to begin with, let's think about how we make the jobs of the present and the jobs of the future more remunerative, more stable, and just better all around, so that we meet people and businesses in the economy where they are.
I don't know how you feel about this, so I'm gonna throw this out there. I think this nostalgia trap is real. That people sort of romanticize the past and think that their parents' generation, for example, was better off than they were. And yet, when I look at the economic data, not only that, when I look at my own life experience, it strikes me that people are actually a lot better off now than they were 50 years ago. A lot richer. And, it just seems to me that it's important to recognize the advances that we have made and the better lives that we're all enjoying. People hate it when I say this. They always, if I say something like this, I immediately get blowback from listeners and viewers who say, oh, it's all right for some, but I'm really struggling. Look, I know there are people who are struggling. There always have been, there always will be, but I'm talking about in aggregate. Americans are now wealthier, people at the same stage of life. So when my parents were in their 30s, they had way less income than today's 30-year-olds tend to have, right? Middle-class people. How do you feel about that?
If you look at wages, it is indisputably true that there has been real wage growth, meaning wage growth adjusted for inflation over the past few decades. As you point out, not everybody, it's not like there's one monolithic worker out there or household out there. There's a lot of heterogeneity among the population, but overall, yes, wages have gone up. And so living standards have gone up. That said, there are two reasons why people might not feel that way. One is that certain key expenses that people experience or key purchases have gotten more out of reach. I'm thinking specifically of housing. We just haven't built enough housing over time. And so housing as a share of income has become, much less affordable particularly in certain parts of the country than it used to be. So that's different. The other thing is that our goalposts have shifted. So setting housing aside, overall, like you might think your parents lived or your grandparents lived a very comfortable existence on less income or, fewer hours. Let's say maybe mom didn't used to work or grandma didn't work in the same way that at the same rate, I should say, that women today are in the labor force. There's a lot of discussion about that. How come people could get by on a single income before and today households needed double income? That's partly because they had a lot fewer things that they bought, right? They didn't have cell phones. Depending on how far back you go, they didn't have television. They didn't have a lot of the same creature comforts that we have today.
Central air conditioning in everybody's house.
Exactly. So they were getting by on one income, but their living standards compared to today were much lower. And it's really hard to kind of wrap your head around that. And it doesn't necessarily make people feel better because they're saying, right? Like, well, of course I shouldn't be, I shouldn't have to live according to the living standards of the 1950s or the 1960s. I want modern medicine and I want modern technology and I want, to be flying around the world and all these things that generations ago people did not expect to be part of their usual household expenses. And so, in some ways, maybe we're comparing the wrong thing, right? Your grandparents' generation didn't need to have as many household work hours outside of the home in the paid labor force to get by because they weren't buying as much stuff. So if they felt more comfortable, it's because their expectations for what a comfortable life looked different. So I think it's worth keeping that in mind. Although, like I said, there's certain things, the American dream of home ownership, that are still very much out of reach. So I'm trying to stay nuanced.
Higher education has gone up ridiculously.
Yeah, higher education has become much more expensive. It's become more necessary to get by in the labor force. Like I said, that's true in manufacturing, but it's true in a lot of other industries as well.
Yeah.
So, it depends. You really need to be making an apples to apples comparison here. And so, in many ways, we are definitely wealthier than we used to be. People may not feel wealthier because their expectations for what they should be able to be purchasing have changed because they're not comparing their lifestyle to that of their parents or their grandparents. They're comparing their lifestyle to that of their neighbors or to people that they see on social media, for that matter, who are living potentially much more glamorous lives, they think, than they are. So it's about keeping up with the Joneses. Who are the Joneses in this circumstance?
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for taking that detour with me. Back to the MAGA myths. So maybe this is a little unfair because it's really only been 1 year, but how are those manufacturing jobs doing in the Trump 2.0 economy?
Not great.
Not good, right?
Not great. In fact, we've had manufacturing job losses for the past 7 consecutive months. So manufacturing definitely not experiencing any sort of renaissance. As I've said, I don't think we should be anticipating that we're going to have massive job growth in manufacturing, powering the future economy, period. But certainly we could at least be aiming for holding steady or, maybe not having a big boom, but not having a big bust. And instead, we seem to be having something of a bust. Manufacturing has been in recession. It's been in recession, to be fair, on and off over the past couple of years. And that's for a number of reasons. But it certainly has not helped that Donald Trump has put all of these tariffs in place. Now, people watching this, listening to this may think, well, weren't the tariffs supposed to help domestic manufacturers? Suddenly they're facing less competition, et cetera. Maybe in theory, but in practice, manufacturers also buy a lot of inputs from abroad. They buy steel, they buy lumber, they buy machinery parts and other kinds of capital equipment. So Trump is also making their expenses get a lot higher as well. There's a working paper that just came out that tries to estimate the effect of tariffs on the U.S. economy, and it found that the tariffs have raised costs for manufacturers by about 1 to 2 percentage points. And if your margins are thin, which is the case for a lot of these companies, that really eats into your ability to hire, to invest, to expand, and to turn a profit for that matter. So yeah, tariffs, not so much helping U.S. manufacturers.
There's another group that Trump had made big promises to that are also being hit by the input price, that because the tariffs have been imposed, the costs for farmers have gone up. Tractors are more expensive, all kinds of things, chemicals that they need, fertilizer. All kinds of things. Yeah. All gone up in price. And meanwhile, the markets are being, the Chinese, are buying many fewer soybeans, for example, et cetera. So the farmers are not, well, tell us, Catherine, how are the farmers doing under the Trump 2.0?
Also not great. As you point out, their costs have gone up and their markets have shrunk. So in the case of soybean farmers, right? Everybody loves to talk about soybean farmers all the time. This is one of these like iconic American industries. Mm-hmm. China was a huge market for them. And under Trump, because of his trade wars, their sales to China plummeted to zero earlier this year. So
that sounds like it might be bad.
Yeah, it's not helpful, right? Their costs are up, their sales are down, and they're really struggling to get by. Now, the White House claims that they are going to get, I wrote this down, the White House claims that China has agreed to buy 12 million bushels of soybeans this year and about double that next year, which would be about roughly what they bought before Trump launched the trade wars. And Trump's skill, if nothing else, is repackaging the prior status quo as a victory. But I'm not sure that really helps farmers here, given that they've already sustained these big losses. Even if they can miraculously go back to the sales level that they had last year, that's not going to plug the hole that has been blown into their profits because they've lost all of those sales this year. Trump is now promising to, basically give them a bailout, just like he did in his first term. But that's not sustainable. And if you're a farmer and you've lost your customers, a one-time check is not going to potentially make up for the fact that those customers may have built relationships with other countries like Argentina or Brazil, exactly, that sell the same kinds of things that you do. So those relationships have in many cases been severed and will be very difficult to rebuild, just as farmers found after the first Trump term.
And they may be thinking, look, why would we want to use American farmers' output when you never know with the U.S. whether they're going to have a new regime that's going to start slapping huge tariffs or not? Maybe better to work with the Brazilians who seem to want the market and are ready to supply us the soybeans that we want to buy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or the Argentinians. Yeah.
That's what I mean. It's like, even if Trump gives them this bailout now, those relationships may have been irreparably harmed with customers. Those customers have moved on. Maybe Trump can get China to agree to, go back to some of their prior purchase levels. But really, lots of customers around the world, and China included, have already moved on to other suppliers, and suppliers who may not seem as erratic in terms of their government's trade policy.
Yeah, it was always, wasn't it? It was always a big advantage that the United States had in international trade, that we were a very stable, reliable trading partner, very stable and reliable military partner, diplomatic partner, all of those things. That sort of iron stability that you could rely on the United States was an economic benefit to us, right?
Yeah.
And now we're squandering it.
Yeah. I mean, part of the reason why the United States has been a good place to do business over the decades is that we have had rule of law. There's a lot more to capitalism than low taxes, as it turns out. You want a stable business environment where you know the rules of the road, where they don't change with short notice, whether through a tweet or otherwise, in terms of changing the costs, for example, or banning certain kinds of exports or imports, or effectively doing so. There was some reliability, there was some greater certainty. And beyond all of that, you knew that your contracts could be enforced. I think that's a subtler way in which this administration's tainting of rule of law has degraded the business environment in the long term in the United States. It used to be, if your counterparty promised you that they would deliver 10 widgets and you paid for the 10 widgets and the widgets didn't arrive, let's say, I'm just making this up, obviously, that you could take them to court and you could make sure that that contract was enforced. And that fostered
or at least that you got made whole. You could get damages.
Right.
Not necessarily that they had to perform, but that at least you'd get damages.
Right. That there was some enforcement that fostered trust because you knew that there was rule of law. That meant you trusted others you were considering doing business with. Today, that's not the case anymore, right? We have an administration that only selectively enforces the law when their friends may benefit, that pardons people convicted of fraud, which, I feel like a lot of times we're aghast at these pardons of big fraudsters in the crypto industry and elsewhere because it just seems distasteful. But it also has longer term consequences for the business environment. Again, if you are not sure whether you engage in a contract with someone, if that contract will be enforceable, because if somebody defrauds you, they might be a buddy of the president or they might hire a lobbyist to go suck up to the president. It makes it much less attractive to do business here. These are kind of abstract things, but we've seen this problem in lots of other countries, generally less industrialized, less developed countries around the world, where people aren't sure about how solid rule of law is, how corrupt or uncorrupt the regime is. It makes it a much less attractive place to invest and to do business. And the Nobel Prize was even awarded, I think it was last year, for this concept of the connection between rule of law and economic growth, that you really need these institutions in place. Not just low taxes, not just low regulations, although those things are often helpful for the business environment as well. But you need institutions that will hold people accountable if they don't behave in ways that allow commerce to thrive. And, generally you're like the experiments or like the studies on these things are about countries that have gone from places that were really corrupt, didn't have great institutions, and how they improved, over time. Like, how did they become, or how, cross-country analyses, or how did a particular country kind of get out of this corruption trap? We're seeing what happens when there's backsliding. And this is a problem that we may not be able to capture or quantify or even notice so well in the near term, but in the long term, it really matters. I'm talking about trade policy and contracts and things like that, but there are other ways in which regulatory uncertainty or sort of like erratic government behavior can make it a much less attractive place to do business. Like, you may remember the Hyundai plant, right? So Donald Trump keeps bragging about the fact that he is getting other countries to invest in the United States. Hyundai developed or has been in the process of building batteries for EVs here in the United States, in Georgia. This plant was actually announced well before Trump's current term, but this plant stands to employ a lot of Americans in Georgia. And Donald Trump launched an ICE raid into that plant that swept up, I believe it was hundreds, if I recall correctly, of high-skilled workers, engineers from Korea who were here setting up that plant, who, as far as we know, at least some of them were here totally legally, had no problems. But it was like the ICE officials had a quota to round up and detain some, minimum number of people. And so people at this Hyundai plant got swept up. And now, and then there was huge outcry and condemnation in Korea. Like, what kind of bad faith raid was this, that you took away our engineers in shackles, essentially, and detained them and treated them so badly? This makes Hyundai much less willing to invest in the United States. It also makes every other company and country that's watching what happened here less interested in investing in the United States, because they don't know what the rules of the road are. They don't exactly understand when rules or laws will be enforced, or when there will be extra legal interventions, which may be the case, I don't know, in these raids at the Hyundai plant. But all of these things add up over time, and they make the United States a much less attractive place to do business.
Yeah, I mean, that Hyundai example really is, it could be a textbook example of adding insult to injury, because it wasn't just that they had an ICE raid, but they took people away in handcuffs. I mean, to show such disrespect to an ally, to a country that is doing exactly what you asked them to do, coming here, building factories that are an investment in the U.S., will help American workers, and to treat them that way, it's just remarkable.
It was a huge scandal in the Korean press at the time.
And it was front page news in South Korea for quite a while, as I understand it. Well, a new year, maybe a wardrobe refresh. Quince has you covered with lovely essentials that feel effortless and look polished. They're perfect for layering, mixing, and building a wardrobe that lasts. Their versatile styles make it easy to reach for them day after day. They have all the staples covered, from soft Mongolian cashmere sweaters that feel like designer pieces without the markup, to 100% silk tops and skirts for easy dressing up, to perfectly cut denim for everyday wear. Their wardrobe essentials are crafted to last season after season. And even though I mentioned skirts and silk tops, and you might think that means these are only for women, no. They also have men's clothing. And in fact, this year at the holidays, I gave Quince beautiful Mongolian sweaters to both men and women on my list. And this was extremely well received, because their quality shows in every detail: the stitching, the fit, the fabrics. Every piece is thoughtfully designed to be your new wardrobe essential. So refresh your wardrobe with Quince. Don't wait. Go to quince.com/Mona for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too, our good friends in Canada. That's Quince, QUINCE.com/Mona to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/Mona. I love the cashmere sweaters, but you can make up your own mind. Okay. And there's another thing you've talked about, which is related to all of this, because, the reputation of the United States, the lack of reliability, stability, and that is namely the central bank. Trump is attempting, he tried it in his first term. It was not successful, but he is now poised to be able to appoint a Fed chair who will be much more obedient. There's talk of Kevin Hassett. I don't know if you've heard any scuttlebutt about that. I've heard that people are telling him, don't do that. It won't go down well with markets. I don't know, but maybe you could shed light on that one. But he is clearly trying to pressure the Fed to do exactly the thing that undermines confidence, which is make decisions on the money supply based on politics.
Yeah. There's a reason why central banks are supposed to be politically independent, and are most successful when they are politically independent here in the United States and around the world. It's that politicians cannot be trusted to be in charge of the money supply. They have totally different incentives. Their incentive is always to pump as much money into the economy as possible in the lead up to an election to sort of, get a little sugar rush out there. So everybody feels really good for a while and they spend more money and maybe they hire, et cetera, et cetera. And so in the near term, the economy looks really good. But the long term, in the long term, that sort of overheating of the economy can be very damaging for prices and fuels inflation. So you want some boring technocrats in charge of interest rates, in charge of the money supply, whose job it is to just do what is best for the economy in the long run, not with an eye towards the next political cycle. And so in the United States, we went through this before. People watching this will maybe remember what happened in the 1970s when both Richard Nixon and before that LBJ leaned heavily on the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates when it was really not in the best interest of the country's inflation long term for them to do so. And that fueled the stagflation that the United States experienced in the 1970s. And it took Paul Volcker, who was put in by Jimmy Carter and kept in place under Ronald Reagan, who jacked up interest rates really, really painfully high to crush inflation. So it took a lot more firepower from the Federal Reserve to get inflation back down to where it needed to be. And it was quite painful at the time and caused a recession. We don't want that to happen. If Donald Trump undoes or degrades the credibility that the Federal Reserve cultivated during the Volcker era and has maintained in the decades since, we may be back in that scenario where people don't trust the central bank to take the punch bowl away. That's the expression, this long-term expression about, you want somebody who's going to make sure the party doesn't get going too good. They need to be willing to be the bad guy and raise interest rates, and in order to maintain price stability and to maintain the long-term best interests of the economy. But that's not where Trump doesn't care about that. Either he doesn't understand or he doesn't care. All he wants is lower interest rates. Look, he's the king of debt. He has wanted low interest rates for other non-political reasons for a very long time because they help him as a borrower.
Yeah.
But beyond that, he understands that in the near term, this is going to juice the economy, and he only cares about the near term. He does not care about the long term. So he wants to put his guy in there. And he threatened to fire Jerome Powell in his first term as when Trump was president, Powell is who he appointed, by the way.
He appointed him. Yep.
Yep. And Powell, his current term as chair ends in a few months. So Trump doesn't need to fire him, although he keeps on threatening, to punish him in other ways anyway.
Yeah.
He just needs to put his own guy in. And Trump keeps saying in tweets and elsewhere that he's going to put someone in who cares about lowering interest rates, not doing what's best for the economy.
There's been a certain amount of talk among some people who write about economics. I'm thinking of Neil Ferguson, who wrote something in the Free Press about how, we were wrong about tariffs. We thought these tariffs were going to cause inflation, and they didn't. So, we got it wrong. What do you think about that?
So a few things. It is true that we have not had this massive burst in inflation that a lot of people feared and potentially predicted. But that's partly because the tariffs haven't actually been executed in the way that Donald Trump first announced, right? He's put them in place and he's delayed them and he's suspended them. And then there have been lawsuits. So we don't actually have the sustained high level of tariffs that were the premise of those huge increases in inflation. Second of all, we have seen increases in inflation. It's just not as big. So if you look at inflation rates, they were declining. When Trump came into office, they were about 3% year over year. They were sort of declining up until April. And then April, we had Liberation Day, and then they started trending upward, and now they're back, in the 3% range again. So we have seen some impact, even if it's not as big of an impact. The other thing to bear in mind is that a lot of companies are betting on the fact that the Supreme Court will strike down the tariffs. And if you look at betting markets, in fact, I don't know what the current numbers say, but overwhelmingly people are expecting this to be the outcome, that the Supreme Court takes away most of Trump's tariffs, which are these national emergency tariffs. If that is the case, and you are a company that has been paying these tariffs and you're expecting to get that money back, you might be more willing to sort of grit your teeth and absorb the cost for the time being rather than pass it on to customers and potentially tick off your customers by having massively higher prices, because you'll say, you know what, I can absorb that cost for now because I know I'm getting that money back pretty soon when the Supreme Court rules. I think that's the bet that a lot of companies are making. Certainly a lot of companies that I have spoken with have basically said, we've raised costs a little because we can't get by otherwise, but we are hoping that we get this money back. And in the meantime, you know, we don't have to pass along the full cost to our customers because they're going to be mad at us. Customers are already mad. Obviously, we've seen, you know, in elections, people are mad about affordability and they're mad at politicians, but they're also mad at companies. So one real question is, first of all, when does the Supreme Court rule? And then how does that affect prices going forward? I don't actually think you're likely to see a big price cut at that time because, like I said, companies have already been like anticipating and maybe baking in that money coming back. But if the Supreme Court surprises everyone and doesn't strike down the tariffs, says that they can persist, then I think all hell is going to break loose. And you will see big price increases because a lot of these companies that have been holding back are going to say, you know what, I guess this is the new reality and we got to raise our prices a lot more. We can't just
or we go out of business.
Or we go out of business. Yeah.
So this is so interesting because, you know, Trump's favorite word in the English language is tariff. And despite the best efforts of his economic advisors in the first term and many, many other people who've tried to persuade him that they're really not good, he loves them and misunderstands them and continues to believe that they're paid by foreigners, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and it's not clear what his objective is, right? Like sometimes he says the goal is to raise more revenue.
Right.
Sometimes he says the goal is to impose a lot of pain so that other countries yield in some other way. You know, they like offer some concessions, in which case we shouldn't be counting on the revenue. This is a cudgel that's only being used temporarily to get some other thing that we want. Sometimes it's about we want to bring a lot of manufacturing back, which, as I've said, is unlikely to happen given the way he's actually implemented these tariffs. In any event, these different sets of objectives that he cites at different times are often mutually exclusive. Right. But he knows he loves tariffs, so he's going to keep doing it anyway.
Right. Well, you can understand, I mean, from his twisted point of view, you can understand why he loves tariffs because they give him so much discretion. He can impose a tariff on Brazil because he doesn't like the fact that they're prosecuting Jair Bolsonaro. He can impose a tariff on Scotland if they, you know, put a windmill near his golf course, you know, whatever it is. It gives
or on Canada because they
ran a commercial.
They ran a commercial with Ronald Reagan's own words being pro-trade. You know, that was a justification for Trump to cut off trade talks.
And the other thing that's so beneficial for him is that he can give tariff breaks to people who shovel money his direction. So we don't know how much of that there's been, but I suspect a fair amount. Okay.
Oh, yeah. ProPublica has done some really good reporting on this, actually, where they looked at some of these bizarre carve-outs for tariffs. And it's like, why is this kind of plastic exempted from tariffs and this one isn't? And it's because people are investing, companies are investing in lobbying this administration to get their personal favors. And, it's another reason why having an erratic political leader who doesn't respect rule of law is bad for doing business, as companies are spending more of their time having to finagle these favors and suck up to the administration and plan and replan and schedule and reschedule where they are getting their supplies from, which we haven't even talked about. There's a lot of that going on as well. booking shipments and canceling them. All of that stuff is very costly. And it means that they're not spending their time doing what they should be doing, which is developing new products and finding new customers and efficiencies and all of the things that are supposed to be good for economic growth. Like you want companies to be thinking about how to make more money, not how to suck up to the administration so that they can be at some kind of competitive advantage relative to other players who didn't hire the right lobbyist.
So I want to circle back to a point you made a few minutes ago where you said a lot of these companies are sort of holding off on raising prices because they believe that the Supreme Court is going to overrule the president on the basis for these tariffs, which were a law called IEEPA, that they're going to say, no, under IEEPA, he doesn't have this authority. So the problem as I see it, though, is that if Trump is as wedded to tariffs as we think he is going to find other legal justifications to impose them. There's Section 302. There's a whole bunch of laws out there. He's used some of them in the past, declaring, national security emergency. I mean, even to say it's just hilarious. He used the national security excuse to impose steel tariffs on Canada in his first term. They were a real national security threat to us. But anyway, so are these companies, are they barking up the wrong tree in the sense that Trump is just going to find another way to impose tariffs?
So Trump's trade advisors have already said that they are trying to cobble together a kind of backup plan. Because as you point out, if the Supreme Court rules, they will only be striking down one particular kind of tariff. Now, that's the one that Trump has been relying on most frequently this past year, in part because it's the easiest thing for him to apply. He can just say it out loud. He can tweet it and it shall be it shall be law or whatever.
Yeah.
Or at least that's how it's been operationalized. Now, a lot of these other tariff authorities that exist that the administration is expected to draw upon have a lot more process involved. There has to be a hearing. There has to be a report from the Department of Commerce. They have to prove their case that these tariffs are necessary. And they're also vulnerable to legal challenge. They were in the first term as well. So it is true that the administration is likely to try to reconstruct a lot of the tariffs that they have in place, even if the Supreme Court takes them away, through these other tariff authorities. But it'll be slower. It will potentially be a little bit more predictable. He can't change it, 5 times within a day via tweet or Truth Social post. There is a process that they have to go through. And to a large extent, those kind of tariffs, depending on which authority he uses, may be more sectoral tariffs. So that means like they are picking a particular product or category of products like steel, as opposed to an entire country. There are still authorities they can use to tariff an entire country, but the hope is, again, maybe misplaced, that maybe they will spend more of their energy like strategically picking out which industries or which products they want to tariff, as opposed to just tariffing everything from the EU or from Canada or from China, for that matter. Like maybe we could be a little bit more strategic about only going after, things that are actually significant to national security or to military use, as opposed to Christmas tree ornaments, which we are also tariffing for some unknown reason.
National emergency, I'm sure.
National emergency, exactly.
One of the things about this whole tariff discussion that you've written about and I've thought about a lot too, is that it is such an obviously boneheaded thing to do. It's so harmful to our economy, and to in every way. It's just bad for America to screw around with our trade relations. that's taken decades to build up. And as you were saying earlier, you cultivate markets and all of that. So it's so obviously bad. It's also inflationary, because as you were saying, when you raise the price of something that you're buying abroad, it costs more, then it causes inflation at home because now your product has to be more expensive. And so you would think that this would be an area where the Democratic Party should be able to ride in on their chargers and say, we've got to stop this absurd policy. We've got to end it. It's bad for America. We want a free trade regime insofar as it's possible. Wherever we can, we want to lower tariffs and make things make it easier to trade with people and create more jobs, more prosperity for everyone. They don't quite say that.
Oh, you're speaking my language. Yes, this should be a huge political windfall for Democrats. The problem is they don't present the most credible answer on tariffs because they themselves have been very protectionist over the years. And in fact, up until Trump, Democrats were generally considered the more protectionist party and Republicans the more free trade party. Of course, Donald Trump has scrambled those political bundles these days. And just to give you an example, when Donald Trump in his first term put a bunch of tariffs in place, had his trade wars, which at the time seemed crazy, but now seem pretty mild by comparison. When he put these in place, there was lots of condemnation from Democrats, including Joe Biden. Let me see. I have the line somewhere. Okay. In 2019, when Joe Biden was a presidential candidate, he said that Trump's tariffs led to, quote, American farmers, manufacturers, and consumers losing and paying more, unquote. The 2020 Democratic platform even said that Trump had, quote, launched reckless, politically motivated tariff wars that have punished American workers, antagonized our allies, and benefited our adversaries, unquote. They were right. They were totally right at the time. But here's the problem. When Joe Biden came into office, he kept pretty much all of those horrific tariffs in place. The tariffs that he and his fellow Democrats had said were abysmal, were killing jobs, were raising prices, he kept almost all of them in place, or he swapped them out for other kinds of trade protections that were equally as restrictive. They just were quotas instead of tariffs, for example. So basically, all of Trump's China tariffs, which Biden had condemned, they kept in place. Trump's solar tariffs, Biden extended, and in fact, he added more solar tariffs as well, even at a time when we were supposed to be investing in lots of renewable energy here in the United States. And there are many more jobs, by the way, in the solar industry related to services than manufacturing. Like you need to maintain and install and service those solar panels and solar arrays. So the Democrats are just not credible on this issue. And they've really struggled, I think, to message on it, because why should anybody take them at their word when before they said Trump's tariffs were cataclysmic and then lo and behold, they kept them around. Now they're saying Trump's tariffs are cataclysmic again, which they are, at least economically. And, who knows? Would the next Democratic president keep them in place? I don't know. And the fact that we can't clearly identify what that policy would be, I think blunts the argument that Democrats can be making or should be making to condemn these policies, which are making everyone poorer and which are killing jobs.
Yeah, it's a kind of political malpractice, honestly, that they cannot take advantage of this fully. It will require a little bit of a reset in their way of looking at trade. I keep hoping that this will be the moment that encourages Democrats to seize the mantle of free trade, just like they've been scared of their shadow on immigration. And maybe this is the moment that inspires Democrats to have a more proactive immigration policy that they can articulate rather than just running away from it. And so far, they have disappointed.
I think maybe it'll come in the next few years, particularly as you see public opinion be so negative on these issues, whether we're talking about trade or the economy or Trump's immigration policies. There is an opportunity for Democrats, to find their footing and to articulate a counter proposal that does the opposite, or at least a more constructive set of policies relative to the really destructive ones Trump has put in place. But so far, they have continued to disappoint.
By the way, Trump is constantly claiming that he's going to be, he's going to really hand the Chinese a setback, with all of these tariffs and so forth. The Chinese have expanded their exports during the past year, not seen them contract. And by the way, I checked this a while back. This was in the long ago era when Biden was president, but I remember looking it up, for all of Trump's talk about, trade deficits, and we don't have to get into that now, but he's wrong that there's nothing wrong with having a trade deficit. He thinks there is. Okay. But just out of curiosity, I looked it up and found out that guess what? Our trade deficit increased under Trump 1. It didn't decrease. So nothing he said. All right. But let's
to your point, just before we move on to your point about China increasing its exports, that's partly because Trump has been effective at uniting much of the rest of the world. He's just uniting them against us.
Against us.
Yeah.
Great.
So you have China able to cozy up to a lot of other countries that may have shared many of the same concerns that we had and maybe still do. But they're like, well, the United States is not a particularly reliable trading partner. Maybe it's worth, rethinking our relationship with China. And in fact, China, South Korea, and Japan got together for their first economic summit, I want to say in over 5 years, something like that, earlier, or just a few months ago, because, historically, these are countries that do not like each other particularly well. There's, a lot of baggage, historical baggage that we don't have to get into, but they don't get along particularly well. They trade a lot with each other because they're neighbors, but have not been particularly interested in deepening those trade ties until the United States, here in the United States, under the auspices of Trump, started becoming a much less reliable trading partner, and we brought all of them closer together.
Yeah, we drove them into each other's arms. Great. All right. One more topic that I want to hear you on, and it's this. The fact is that the high cost of goods and services doomed Biden's presidency and doomed Kamala Harris's campaign. I mean, immigration played a role too, but I think there's no question that a big part of why voters were unhappy is because of high prices. Trump claimed that he was going to bring it all down. People actually voted for him believing that, I think as you put it, that you can press the deflation button or something, and that, he would come into office and prices would come down. And of course, there is no deflation button. But here's my question for you, and it's a little bit of a worry, which is the Democrats are saying, okay, we see it now. The message for 2026 and beyond is affordability. All we have to do is keep saying affordability, and we will win. And that's the golden ticket. And my concern is, well, you can say it and you might even win in 2026 just by saying it, but eventually you are going to have to deliver. And what's the Democrats' plan on helping people afford things?
This is a huge worry that I have as well, because it is very easy to be the party out of power, complaining about how high prices are and promising that you will fix that problem. That's how Donald Trump got into office, and that is how Democrats seem to be building some political momentum now. But it is much more difficult to actually execute a plan that delivers on that promise. First of all, the promise that prices will go down cannot be achieved, or at least not in any way that is healthy for the economy. Deflation in an economy that is the overall price level outright declining generally only happens when an economy is very, very sick. It's what happened during the Great Depression. It happened in Japan in the 90s. It's not intuitive, but you don't want prices to outright fall. What the Federal Reserve...
In aggregate. I mean, individual prices can come down. But
right. Gas prices go up and down,
Right.
If you have bird flu, egg prices can go up, and then the chicken stocks get replenished. There are more flocks, and then they have more eggs, and then the prices go down. So individual products, yes, can go up and down, but the overall price level, the overall bundle of goods that people pay for, should not be falling. If it is falling, that generally means that everything is terrible. Every company out there has to put everything on a fire sale in order to lure back customers. It's not a good situation.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's not intuitive. I think this is one of the big divides between what economists think is good for the economy and what the general public thinks is good for the economy. They want prices to go back down. Economists are like, no. That leads to all sorts of bad things. What you can promise that is more achievable, maybe, is that prices stop rising as quickly, or that wages start rising faster so that people can absorb the price gains that they've already had to accumulate, right? That is what politicians should be aiming for. It's not as easy to sloganeer as saying, I'm going to bring prices down, but that's what they should be going for. It's still hard. Don't get me wrong. It's still very, very hard. There are different ways that you could try to get it done, through having a better business environment, encouraging more investing, lots of things that, Democrats and Republicans have difficulty achieving for different reasons. You could subsidize particularly high cost things like health insurance in a way that hopefully helps the people who need it the most, rather than just giving everybody more money so that it pushes prices up higher. You could try to, encourage the greater supply of housing. There are a lot of different things that you could do that might be helpful. Donald Trump is basically doing none of them. Instead, he is putting in place a bunch of policies that make the problem worse. Not only is he not achieving his unachievable goal of cutting prices, he is actively raising prices through all of the things that we were just talking about, through tariffs, through mass deportations, which disproportionately affect, for example, agriculture and construction. Again, food and housing, two areas that have become, real sore points in the affordability conversation, and by weighing on the Federal Reserve, which in the long run, if he continues to politicize it, will have a lot more difficulty keeping prices stable. So all of those things are, again, the antithesis of what he has promised. What are Democrats going to do? I mean, at the very least, they could stop doing the bad stuff. They could do no harm. They could roll back the things that Donald Trump has put in place. But as for a lot of these other kinds of things, like increasing the supply of housing, for example, they really struggle with how to achieve a lot of that, even if it's hard. They have different constituencies that they're trying to appease, that make it much more challenging to just have a clean set of incentives just for the purpose of increasing the supply of something. This is this whole debate on the left about the abundance movement, which is probably the topic for another podcast. But Democrats have struggled with that as well. And I do worry that we're going to be stuck in this infinite doom loop of voters throwing the bums out, throwing out the incumbents because the party out of power has promised lower prices. Then the party out of power gets in office and they also can't deliver. And then we're stuck in this infinite cycle of people parties overpromising, with these very populist messages and then unable to deliver. People get disillusioned, throw them out, and you repeat the cycle over again. And I don't know how we get out of that. It's a problem that other countries have experienced as well. Argentina, for example, had this problem with, the left-wing populists and the right-wing populists constantly overpromising and being unable to deliver. And they had big problems with hyperinflation as well. So I don't know how you escape that doom loop, but I'm very worried that it is coming.
Okay. I said that was the last issue, but I have one more.
Oh, okay.
Real quick. And it's this. So one of the things that Trump seems very tempted to do in this moment is to just send people checks. So he's talking about sending $2,000 checks to everybody, which is supposedly money from the tariffs. He's sending $1,776 to the troops, which is coming out of housing, but never mind that. He is promising to create funds for every baby that's born that will, start with $1,000. So let's assume that he can do that legally.
Big assumption, but sure.
Yeah, it is a big assumption. But let's just, for argument's sake, let's say he can do it legally. How do you think that will go down with the electorate?
Well, who doesn't like getting cut a check, right? I think this is generally a popular thing to do. Trump did it in his first term during COVID, actually a couple of times in his first term during COVID. And it is generally well received in the near term. But if you look at polling from the various times that not only Trump, but other presidents have sent out effectively stimulus checks, the memory that people have of the gratitude, let's say, that they have is very, very short-lived. Like if you look at Obama also sent out stimulus checks when he was president.
So did Biden.
So did Biden. Biden did as well. People don't really remember those checks from Biden, but they did probably, at least on the margin, contribute to inflation. If you give almost everybody more cash to spend at the same time and the economy is not actually producing a lot more stuff at that time, which was the case then because we had these huge supply chain interruptions due to COVID, you have more money chasing the same number of goods, and that just pushes prices up. So it's not the only reason why we had this elevated inflation under Biden, but it certainly did not help. And when you ask people, when people were asked in polls in subsequent months, did Biden do anything to help your finances? They forgot about these checks entirely. Like people said no. The same thing happened when Obama sent out checks. And I believe as well under George W. Bush, who also sent out some stimulus checks when there was a recession when he was in office, the first term. So the checks sound great in the near term. Maybe if you brand them with your name, as Trump has done, you get some political credit initially. But A, they can have pretty negative consequences economically. That they can backfire if they supercharge inflation. And B, people don't seem to remember them. So it's not really clear that this is like the silver bullet for Donald Trump going forward, particularly if they contribute more to inflation, which they might. And then, like I said, your initial premise, which is that he can do this, is also questionable. Yeah. It requires an act of Congress. We are not actually getting in that much tariff revenue. As I said, the Supreme Court may say all of that tariff revenue has to get returned to companies anyway. So maybe we'll have no additional tariff revenue at the end of the day. The checks that Trump sent out to service members were actually just stolen from a different housing subsidy that Congress had given to service members. So basically, Trump
took it out of one pocket and put it in
exactly.
another.
So it wasn't actually on net giving soldiers any more money.
Right.
I don't think that's going to be inflationary per se, but I don't really think it made a whole lot of a difference either. And that's a small part of the population. If we were talking about these near universal checks or universal checks, those might have a much bigger effect on the price level.
Catherine Rampell, thank you for joining me. I also just want to say how thrilled we are at the Bulwark that you have joined us. You are an ornament to the Bulwark, and we are thrilled to have you. And thanks so much for going through all of this with me today, and look forward to doing it again in the future.
My pleasure. Happy to come back anytime.